Well, many thanks for that very generous introduction and for the reflection on the remarkable work that's going on here. You know, when they're trying to keep journalists from getting too arrogant, they remind us all the time that yesterday's newspaper is used to wrap fish. And so the idea that an article that I wrote could have ultimately played any part in leading to the formation of this center and others like it is immensely meaningful to me, more than I can possibly begin to say. And I just want to pay a moment of tribute to what's happened here in Colorado and at the university. It's an extraordinary leap that was taken. It was a leap into territory that was partly unknown and that could be challenging, and it was done with enormous grace and dignity and has led, I think, to the saving of untold thousands upon thousands of lives. So a round of applause for that, please. One of the consequences of taking a public role as someone interested in and engaged with depression is that you become the recipient of endless letters from people who are writing to you. The people who write to me, many of them, are so alone. They're more alone than you can imagine. They're so alone that none of you will know them because nobody knows them. They get up and they have something to eat and they go into a job where they interact with a machine all day long, either in a factory or with a computer. And then they come home picking up something to eat on the way back and sit and eat it in front of a television and go to bed and get up and repeat the whole thing the next day. It's terrifying to encounter that aloneness and how many of them have actually come far enough to admit they have depression. They've come far enough to be writing to me, and yet they nonetheless don't know where to begin to find any treatment or resolution. And those who have sought treatment have in many instances received poor treatment. So do we need depression centers? We need them as centers of clinical excellence, and we need them, moreover, as places where people who are going through this can find community with one another, and we need them as centers of research. We need them in every possible way there is to need facilities of that kind. There's such need for a place to go. I'm going to try to describe to you a little bit of what depression is like. And I'll start with a poem by Emily Dickinson that I remember reading and thinking, yes, that's it. She wrote, "I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till I thought that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll as if the heavens were a bell and being were an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. Just then a plank in reason broke, and I fell down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then." Depression is the flaw in love. The capacity for extreme emotions is part of what makes us human. And love as we would not be love as we know it if people who loved one another could think, well, my wife died, I was very fond of her, I'll find another one, it's not a big deal. I mean, you have to be capable of being plunged into a state of despair to form what we think of as meaningful and real attachments. How is it, if you have the existence of love, that you can have the non-existence of depression? I often say that depression represents a point in which a very useful mood spectrum gets carried so far that it becomes no longer useful. That terrible specter of despair that is an engine of intimacy is nonetheless an agonizing illness when it gets carried too far. In 1991, I had kind of a bad year. My mother died, a relationship that I'd been in ended. I moved back from England, where I'd lived for some years, to the United States and didn't yet know how I was going to make sense of my life here. I was overwhelmed at the time, and then I began to feel bored by things. I remember losing interest. I remember thinking that there was something I was supposed to do and thinking, maybe I won't bother. Maybe I won't do that thing. I often say that the opposite of depression is not happiness, but vitality. And it was vitality that seemed to leach away from me in that particular instant. I remember coming home and looking at my answering machine, back in the days of answering machines, and its little red light would be blinking, and instead of thinking, oh, my friends love me, they've called to see who I am, I would think, what a lot of people to have to call back. What a lot of calls to have to make. What a lot of messages even to have to listen to. And then things began becoming difficult. I would think, I should have lunch now, but it felt to me like an impossibility. I would have to get the food out of the refrigerator. I would have to put it on a plate. I would have to cut it up and chew it and swallow it. And those activities felt to me like the stations of the cross. And one of the things that often gets lost in the narrative of depression is that you know it's ridiculous even when you're most in its throes. I knew perfectly well that it was possible to do all of these things, and that most people ate lunch every day. Not always quite like this, but they ate lunch every day, and that it shouldn't be so difficult. And yet it was an incontrovertible fact. It was more than I could manage. And then the anxiety set in. Anxiety and depression are related both biologically and experientially. And when the anxiety began, it was the worst feeling I'd ever had. I felt terrified all the time. I had that feeling that you might have if you slip and trip just before you hit the ground. But instead of lasting a split second like that does, it lasted day after day, week after week, ultimately month after month. I was so frightened, but I couldn't say what it was that I was so afraid of. I didn't know what the fear was. I just knew that I felt this terrible, consuming fear. And frankly, if you said to me, you have to be depressed for a month, I would not be pleased about it, but I would say, okay, as long as I know I'll be okay by the end of October, I'll manage it. But if you said I had to experience acute anxiety for the next month, I would be in a state of immediate despair, because even knowing that it would go away, the idea of feeling that way for a month would be so horrifying and so anathema. I reached a point at which just being alive felt so painful. And one day, I remember waking up and feeling so petrified that I couldn't move. I thought I might have had a stroke. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't go to take a shower. I couldn't do anything. And I looked at the phone, which was right next to my bed, and I thought I should call someone and I should get help. And I couldn't bring myself to reach out and pick up the phone and dial it. And I spent 4 hours staring at the phone, trying to get up the energy to reach out and touch it, and it began to ring. And it was my father. And I said, something has gone horribly wrong. And he said, I'll be right there. Now, I had two advantages as I entered into the world of depression. One was that I knew that objectively I had rather a nice life, and if I could only get better, there was a good life to enjoy on the other side. But the other was that I had access to good treatment. I had it because I came from a relatively advantaged background. I had it because I was in New York where there was good treatment. And I had it because my father, it would embarrass me to be so reliant on him when I was almost 30 years old, but my father managed to see to it that I got into the best possible treatment. But despite all of that, I got better, and I thought, well, I'm through with that. And I went off treatment, and I relapsed. And then I emerged, and then I relapsed. And then I emerged, and then I relapsed. And I went on playing that idiotic game that almost everyone plays when they're first dealing with depression. The reality is that while some people have a single episode triggered by particular circumstances, for most people this is a chronic condition, and you have to keep on top of it, and you have to keep treating it. For me, it was medication and talking therapy, psychodynamic therapy that helped. Different things have helped different people. I was lucky, as I say, to have the help, but even so, I went through years and years and years of wobbling around one way and another. Now, our understanding of the brain right now, despite the good work of researchers at this depression center and elsewhere, our understanding of the brain is incredibly primitive. The treatments for mental illness that exist are in many ways appalling. They're very expensive, they often don't work, they carry innumerable side effects. But recent progress is dazzling. I feel so grateful to live now and not 50 years ago, because 50 years ago, the things that have helped me were unavailable. And if I had had depression then, there would have been almost nothing to do with it. But my sincere hope is that 50 years from now, people will look back at the treatment that I've had and say, how could you endure anything so primitive? There's a great need for progress. There's a great need for research. There's a great need to advance. And there's a great need to acknowledge that while psychiatry is deeply flawed, flawed is not the same thing as worthless. Psychiatry is saving every day the lives of so many people who might otherwise be ending their lives or living lives with nothing of value in them. Now, when I set out to write my book, I was interested in two essential questions. The first was that I had discovered that I met people who had what sounded as they described it, like relatively minor depression, who were nonetheless completely disabled by it. And equally, I had met people who had what sounded when they described it like very severe depression, who nonetheless managed to have good lives, at least in the interstices between their depressive episodes. And I wanted to understand what the mechanisms of resilience were. And I also wanted to get away from this idea that depression is a modern, Western, middle-class illness by reflecting on the way it's functioned in a variety of contexts. In terms of getting away from it as a modern illness, I will tell you that Hippocrates, writing 2,500 years ago, gave a description of depression as a situation of patients who lost the will to live, who were extremely anxious and upset, who withdrew from the rest of life. He gave a description that would work perfectly well today, and that he had an argument ongoing with Plato, because Plato said, this is a philosophical problem that has to be resolved through dialogue. And Hippocrates said it's an organic dysfunction of the brain, and we should figure out how to treat the brains of these people. So that argument between talk therapy and medication that you thought was the thing of the last 20 years, it's been going on since 500 BC. I also was struck as I did this work by how often the people I interviewed and spoke to were investing an enormous amount of energy in keeping their condition secret. Now, depression is very hard to deal with. It absorbs a lot of energy. Secrecy absorbs a lot of energy. And far too often, the energy that could have gone into ameliorating the depression instead went into keeping a secret. And I remember particularly being at a conference some years ago, not about depression, about something else entirely. And it was a weekend long. And on Friday, this woman took me aside and she said, I've suffered from depression and I'm now taking medication, but I'm not sure I'm doing the right things. And what do you think? And I gave her whatever information I could. And she said, look, my husband is also here at this conference. She said, please don't say anything to him because I've never discussed that with him. He's just the kind of man who wouldn't be able to understand it. And I said, okay. On Sunday, this woman's husband took me aside. He said, please don't tell my wife because she wouldn't think I was a real guy if she knew. But actually, he said, I have this depression and I've been getting some treatment for it. And the two of them were taking the same medication and hiding it in two different spots in the same bedroom. And I suggested that communication in their marriage might be complicating their mental health. Understanding the brain, which is what we all are striving to do through the work in this room, should never preclude understanding human thought or people's essential humanity. Because as it turns out, know thyself is the trickiest instruction that's ever been given. When I was in college, one of my best friends developed bipolar disorder. She had a psychotic episode and then plunged into a horrifying depression. And then she was put on lithium and she was stabilized and she was fine for many years. And then an incompetent psychiatrist said, you've been fine for so long, why don't we take you off all your medication and see how you are? Bipolar illness is a lifetime illness. And she developed another psychotic episode and then plunged into a catatonic depression in which she didn't speak and didn't look at anyone and didn't interact. And she too moved into her parents' apartment, though she was 40 and they were in their 80s because there was no place else she felt she could go. And I remember going up to see her there when she was just sitting in that complete silence, seemingly unaware of who came and went in the room. And when I talked to her about it afterwards, she said, I would lie in my bed singing, "Where have all the flowers gone?" over and over again to occupy my mind. I wanted to occupy my mind to drown out the voices there that said, you are nothing. You don't even deserve to live. You are worthless. And that was when I really began to contemplate killing myself. You don't think in depression that you're seeing the world darkly through the veil of a bad mood. You think you're seeing the world truly because the veil has been taken away and now you can see what things are actually like. It's easy or easier to try to exorcise the demons of schizophrenics who perceive that there's something foreign inside them. But it's not so easy with us because we believe we are seeing the truth, but the truth lies. And I want to pursue for a moment that idea of the truth lies. There's a lot of work that actually does indicate that people who are depressed see things very correctly, and that those of us who are not depressed often see the world through rosier glasses than we know or imagine. It's actually the case that often there are insights that come with depression, and it's also the case that those insights can themselves be extremely dangerous. So when people are depressed, they say things that are untrue and that are easy to respond to. Someone says, nobody loves me, and you can say, I love you, your wife loves you, your children love you. There are lots of things to say in response to that. But people who are depressed also say things like, well, no matter what we do in this life, in the end, we're all just going to die anyway. Or they say, I love a lot of people, but there's always a barrier. No two people ever truly know and understand each other. And you have to say to them, that's true, but why don't we think about what to have for lunch today and move them away from it? And my favorite study demonstrating this issue was one in which a group of depressed and non-depressed people were each asked to play a video game for an hour. And at the end of the hour, they were asked how many little monsters they thought they had killed. And the depressed people were by and large accurate to within 10%. And the non-depressed people by and large guessed between 15 and 20 times as many little monsters as they had actually killed. So I began this work as a real medical conservative. I thought there's medication, there are certain proven forms of psychotherapy, and the rest of it all seems ridiculous to me, the many alternatives that people approached with. But over time, I've changed that position. Because if you have brain cancer and you say it makes you feel better to eat a lot of mushrooms and stand on your head every morning, you may feel better from doing that, but you still have brain cancer, and it's still likely to kill you if you don't do anything else about it. But if you have depression and say that doing those things makes you feel better, then it's worked, because depression is a disease of how you feel. And if you feel better when you do those things, then you're not so depressed anymore. I get a lot of letters from people asking me to describe a variety of alternatives, and was particularly touched by the message I got from a woman who said she had tried absolutely everything. She had tried things over and over again. She had done medication, she had done therapy, she had done these other things, and she had finally found a solution and hoped I would broadcast it to the world, and that solution was making little things from yarn, some of which she sent to me, none of which I'm wearing today. And I decided that it perhaps wasn't important to draw a distinction between obsessive compulsive disorder and depression. But I also thought if it works and she's not depressed anymore, then more power to her and to the yarn. Now, in a more extreme example of the ways in which alternatives are being pursued in the modern world, there was someone I got to know named Frank Rusakov. Frank went to Northwestern. He was on the soccer team. He was popular. He's rather good looking. He was an all-around kind of guy, a little bit like the description of Max that was in the video, Max when he was not depressed. And then a couple of years after he graduated, he was driving to a movie theater to see a movie, and he was so overwhelmed with the feeling that he had to kill himself that he didn't even go to the theater, and he just drove to a hospital and checked himself in. And in the decade that followed, he was not very responsive to medication. He ended up in a treatment regimen in which at the beginning of each month, he would go to the hospital, he would have ECT or electroconvulsive therapy, which remains, it's not the easiest by any means, but it is the most effective treatment there is for depression now. He would have ECT, he would be disoriented for a few days because of the ECT, he would have a week of feeling more or less okay, he would have a week or 10 days of going downhill, and then he'd be back at the hospital again. And he said, I can't go on like this, I can't live like this. He said, I have a plan for a way to end it if I can't find a way through. But he also told me that he had heard about a brain surgery called a cingulotomy, in which a small lesion is burned into the anterior cingulum of the brain. And he said that he was going to try it. And I remember thinking, where does he find the hope after he's failed 40 things? When he's suffering from acute depression, where does he find the hope that leads him to try one more thing? And he went off and he had a cingulotomy. It's not a widely practiced procedure, and it's not widely effective, but it was effective for him. And he wrote me a beautiful letter the following Christmas. And he said, my father gave me 2 presents for Christmas this year. One was a motorized CD rack, back in the days of CDs. He said that I didn't really need and that I loved. He said, but the other was a portrait of my grandmother who committed suicide. When I opened it up, I began to cry. And my father asked if I was crying because of all of the relatives I had never known. And I said, she had the same disease I have. I'm crying as I write to you now. Maybe it's just that I could have killed myself, but my parents and the doctors convinced me to keep going. I'm pleased to say that that young man, who is now less young than he was then, is now married and has 2 delightful children, to whom I remain very close. I was interested in this question of these alternative approaches. I've been interested in the more recent work that Helen Mayberg has done at Emory, in which she has done deep brain stimulation using devices similar to those used in Parkinson's that are surgically implanted in the brains only of people with very severe and totally intractable depression. She records the sessions, and the patient has to be conscious while the procedure is going on to make sure that nothing is going in the wrong way. And she turns the device on but doesn't tell them when she turns it on. And it stimulates this area 25 in their brain. And there's amazing footage of one patient. The device was turned on. She hadn't said anything, and the patient said, what did you just do? And she said, why do you ask? And he said, all my life, I've been stuck in a room with 1,000 screaming children, and they've just left the building. Now, I also wanted to look at the more far-flung versions of alternatives. As I said, I wanted to get away from the idea that this was a Western illness. I went to Greenland to look at depression among the Greenlandic Inuit, to Cambodia to look at the way people dealt with depression following the Khmer Rouge. And I went to Senegal because I knew there were tribal rituals for the treatment of mental illness, and I wanted to understand them better. And I had a friend who had a Senegalese girlfriend, and she had a friend who was a cousin of a friend of, it was a long line of connections that led to someone who actually practiced this ritual called the Ndop. And so I went off and interviewed Madame Diouf about the practice of the Ndop, and she told me all about it. It was a fascinating interview. And at the end, I said, a little shyly, I said, you know, is there any possibility I could actually see an Ndop being performed? And she said, well, I've certainly never had a foreigner, the word was tubob, I've never had a tubob at one before, but you've come through friends. Yes, if you would like, you may stay here and see an Ndop. And I said, how great. I said, when will you next be performing one? And she said, oh, sometime in the next 6 months. And I said, 6 months is rather a long time for me to stay here, waiting for this to happen. Wonder if anything could be expedited. And she said it didn't work that way. And I said, well, I was sorry I wasn't going to get to see it, but I was so glad to have met her, and I thanked her very much. And as I was leaving, she said, excuse me? And I said, yes. And she said, I hope you don't mind my saying this. And I said, no, what? And she said, you don't look so great yourself. She said, are you suffering from depression? And I said, well, kind of. I'm not in such a bad place now, but I certainly have. She said, I've certainly never done this for a tubob before, but I could do an Ndop for you. And I said, oh, what an interesting idea. Yes, perhaps we'll do that. So I will not take you through the entire ritual that I was involved with, but I will tell you that the high point came when I found myself in the central square of the small town where she lived, in a makeshift wedding bed with a ram, and with the entire population of the village going around us in concentric circles and throwing sheets of cloth over us. And at a certain key moment, the drumming stopped, the cloth was all pulled off, I was yanked to my feet. The loincloth that was all I was wearing was pulled away from me, the ram's throat was slit, and I was covered in the blood of the freshly slaughtered ram. And I thought, this is kind of a change from psychotherapy as I previously experienced it. But some years later, when I was working on another book and I had gone to Rwanda, I described this whole thing to someone in Rwanda. And he said, well, that's West Africa, this is East Africa. We don't have anything that's that much like that, but things that are a little like it. He said, you know, he said, it's kind of interesting to hear about it. We had a lot of trouble with Western mental health workers who came just after the genocide. And I said, oh, what happened? And he said, well, what they did was nothing like what you've described. They didn't get people outside where the sun is shining, where you begin to feel better. They didn't get the entire community involved in what was going on. They didn't have drumming that makes your blood run. They didn't have any identification of the problems you were having as external things that could be cast out of your body. He said, instead, they took people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and asked them to talk for 50 minutes about bad things that had happened to them. He said, we had to ask them to leave the country. Now, I'll just quickly say that I said I wanted to look at depression as being not modern, Western, or middle class. And I spent considerable time working on depression among the indigent, or as my talk title came up when I was doing a talk at the APA, among the indignant. But it was supposed to be indigent. And there were a number of pilot studies that were going on in which people explored what the situation was of impoverished people who were depressed. And what they discovered is that mostly they don't self-identify as depressed. Because if you have a very nice life and you suddenly start to feel miserable all the time, you think to yourself, well, what's wrong with me? Why do I feel so miserable? And you think, perhaps I have a diagnosable illness. But if your life is unbelievably difficult and you feel awful all the time, it seems to make perfect sense that the awfulness of your feelings correlates with the awfulness of your life. And it would never occur to you that you have any particular kind of a syndrome. And so most people who are poor and depressed don't identify as poor and depressed. There's someone who was getting people in by doing random screenings at a health clinic. And I interviewed many of the women she had brought in. It was all women she was working with. And there was one of them who, when I saw her the first time, was this tiny woman. She was in a terrible abusive relationship. She had 8 children. She said, I hate when my children come home from school. I'm under the bed with the door locked. I can't stand to see them. I can't stand to be with them. I'm losing more and more weight. I had a job, but I had to give it up because I couldn't do anything. And after 8 months of treatment in this study, I went back to see her. She had a job working in childcare for the Navy. She had broken up with the abusive boyfriend, and she described being with her children. And she said, there's one room in the new house. She'd moved into a new place. One room in the new house for the boys and one for the girls. But they're all just getting up on my bed at night so we can do homework together and everything. That's all I need now is my kids. I had no idea what it would feel like to be happy. I sure hope it's going to last. Every day I get better. I'm not afraid anymore. I can walk out the door of my house not being afraid. And if it weren't for Dr. Miranda and that, I'd still be in bed with the door locked if I was still alive at all. I asked the Lord to send me an angel, and he heard my prayers. I then wanted to write about this extraordinary discovery for the New York Times Magazine, and they agreed that I could do a piece. And when I turned in the piece, my editor called and said, you know, Andrew, we really can't publish this piece. And I said, why not? And she said, well, because the story of these women who were kind of totally dysfunctional, and then 6 months later, they're virtually ready to join ranks at Morgan Stanley. She said, it's just too unbelievable. I've never heard of anything like it. And I said, the fact that you have never heard of it, but that it is happening, is what makes it news. You are a news magazine. Let's get the news out. And I believe that it would serve not only our humanitarian interests, but also our economic interests to take care of families like that woman, Lolly Washington, and her family. Because those mothers, when they get better, are helping their kids to succeed and are putting away the possibility of endless and significant drains that would lie in the future for us, not only emotionally, but also economically. Now, I want to return for a moment to the question of depression treatment. People often say, oh, but I don't want to stay on treatment for my depression because the treatment seems so unnatural, and I feel like I need to just be my real self. And I feel like we do a lot that's unnatural. I mean, it's unnatural to brush your teeth, but you don't hear people militating against toothpaste or celebrating the courage of people whose teeth are rotting and falling out by the time they're 30 years old. And in the same way, these medications, though they are confusing and complicated, and these forms of treatment, though there are many of them and they can be difficult and complicated and bewildering, even when they're talk forms of treatment, These forms of treatment are not essentially erasing a valuable true self. They are enabling a better true self. If I went without my meds, I would end up with more psychopathology, I'm sure. I would have written less. I probably wouldn't have become a father and gotten married. Is that my true self? Is the person who's standing up and talking to you now, today, an artificial self or a lesser self? People say, I don't want to take happy pills. But as I said, depression is a loss of vitality, not a loss of happiness. I'm as sad as I ever was, but right now I'm sad about failed relationships and professional disappointments and the question of global warming. I'm not sad about having to eat lunch or having to go out. When I talked to Frank Rusakov about this question of resilience, he said, he's the guy who had the cingulotomy, he said, if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't do it this way. But now that I've been there, I have such good relationships with my parents, with my doctor. I'm such a different person than I would have been without it. And I guess I'm pretty happy with how I turned out. So I guess while I said I wouldn't do it again this way, in some ways maybe I would. And Maggie described to me how she had gotten a job working in an AIDS residence. And she said, I was supposed to give them tea and make conversation. She said, and I would give them tea, and then I would talk and talk and talk. And they weren't very responsive. And I thought, this is not very friendly or helpful of them. She said, and then I realized they really didn't want to tell me anything. They just wanted it to be a situation where they were really sick, and they were probably going to die soon, and I wasn't really sick, and I wasn't going to die soon, but I could tolerate the fact that they were sick, and that they were going to die soon. Our needs are our greatest assets. I've learned to just be there with people because that's what I needed from people. I've learned to give all the things I need, and it has given me a richer life than I would ever have had otherwise. So it's not that depressions are wonderful and that everyone should have one, but it's a question of whether those who have been through that experience gain some kind of meaningful insight. And what does that meaningful insight look like? And many of the people who gained insight seem to have gained also a sense that they grew through their depression. I started off by saying I looked at the mechanism of resilience, and I think the central mechanism of resilience is finding meaning. It's finding meaning in the experience you've had. And the choice to find meaning is a choice. People choose. They're going to find some kind of meaning in what has already happened to them or what is happening to them. And if you can find meaning in it, it gives you a way through and a way forward. I believe that I'm a better husband and a better father because I've had those experiences. It doesn't ultimately matter whether that's true. It matters that I believe it. It allows me to go on with my life. I felt that funeral in my brain. But one day, something I would have to call a soul emerged in me when hell came to pay a surprise visit. I hate being depressed, and I don't want to ever be depressed again. But in some curious way, I have learned to love the depression itself. That was a choice. It is a choice to think each day that I'm choosing to find and to cling to joy, and that I'm deciding, sometimes against the moment's logic, to choose to stay alive over and over again. To me, that is a privileged rapture and the essence of resilience. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.